"You said your father managed the mayor's horses until his death," Will Dearborn said. "Was his name Patrick Delgado? It was, wasn't it?" She looked down at him, badly startled and brought back to reality in an instant. "How do you know that?" "His name was in our lessons of calling. We're to count cattle, sheep, pigs, oxen, and horses. Of all your livestock, horses are the most important. Patrick Delgado was the man we were to see in that regard. I'm sorry to hear he's come to the clearing at the end of the path, Susan. Will you accept my condolence?" "Aye, and with thanks." "Was it an accident?" "Aye." Hoping her voice said what she wanted it to say, which was leave this subject, ask no more. "Let me be honest with you," he said, and for the first time she thought she heard a false note there. Perhaps it was only her imagination. Certainly she had little experience of the world. Aunt Cord reminded her of this almost daily. But she had an idea that people who sat on by saying, "Let me be honest with you," were apt to go on by telling you straight-faced that rain fell up, money grew on trees, and babies were brought by the grand featherettes. "I will, Dearborn," she said, her tone just the tiniest bit dry. "They say honesty's the best policy, so they do." He looked at her a bit doubtfully, and then his smile shone out again. That smile was dangerous, she thought, a quicksand smile if ever there was one, easy to wander in, perhaps more difficult to wander back out. There's not much affiliation in the affiliation these days. That's part of the reason Farson's gone on as long as he has. That's what has allowed his ambitions to grow. He's come a far way from the harrier who began as a stage robber in Garland and DeSoy, and he'll come farther yet if the affiliation isn't revitalized, maybe all the way to Mages. She couldn't imagine what the good man could possibly want with her own sleepy little town in the barony which lay closest to the clean sea, but she kept silent. "In any case, it wasn't really the affiliation that sent us," he said. "Not all this way to count cows and oil derricks and hectares of land under cultivation." He paused a moment, looking down the road, as if for more rocks in the way of his boots, and stroking Rusher's nose with absent-minded gentleness. She thought he was embarrassed, perhaps even shamed. "We were sent by our fathers." "You're—" Then she understood. Bad boys they were, sent out on a make-work quest that wasn't quite exile. She guessed their real job in Hambry might be to rehabilitate their reputations. Well, she thought, it certainly explains the quicksand smile, doesn't it? Wear this one, Susan. He's the sort to burn bridges and upset mail carts, then go on his merry way without a single look back. Not in meanness, but in plain old boy carelessness. That made her think of the old song again, the one she'd been singing, the one he'd been whistling. Our fathers, yes. Susan Delgado had cut a caper or two, or perhaps it was 24 of her own in her time, and she felt sympathy for Will Dearborn as well as caution, and interest. Bad boys could be amusing, up to a point. The question was, how bad had Will and his cronies been? "Helling?" she asked. "Helling," he agreed, still sounding glum, but perhaps brightening just a bit about the eyes and mouth. "We were warned. Yes, warned very well. There was a certain amount of drinking." "And a few girls to squeeze with the hand not busy squeezing the ale-pot?" It was a question no nice girl could outright ask, but one that couldn't help occurring to her mind. Now the smile, which had played briefly around the corners of his mouth, dropped away. "We pushed it too far, and the fun stopped. Fools have a way of doing that. One night there was a race, one moonless night. After midnight, all of us drunk. One of the horses caught his hoof in a gopher hole and snapped a foreleg. He had to be put down." Susan winced. It wasn't the worst thing she could think of, but bad enough. And when he opened his mouth again, it got worse. The horse was a thoroughbred, one of just 3 owned by my friend Richard's father, who is not well-to-do. There were scenes in our households which I haven't any desire to remember, let alone talk about. I'll make a long story short and say that after much talk and many proposals for punishment, we were sent here on this errand. It was Arthur's father's idea. I think Arthur's dad has always been a bit appalled by Arthur. Certainly Arthur's ructions didn't come from George Heath's side. Susan smiled to herself, thinking of Aunt Cordelia saying, "She certainly doesn't get it from our side of the family." Then the calculated pause, followed by, "She had a great-aunt on her mother's side who ran crazy." "You didn't know?" "Yes. Set herself on fire and threw herself over the drop. In the year of the comet it was." "Anyway," Will resumed, "Mr. Heath set us on with a saying from his own father. One should meditate in purgatory. And here we are." "Hambry's far from purgatory." He sketched his funny little bow again. "If it were, all should want to be bad enough to come here and meet the pretty denizens." "Work on that one a bit," she said in her driest voice. "It's still rough, I fear. Perhaps—" She fell silent as a dismaying realization occurred to her. She was going to have to hope this boy would enter into a limited conspiracy with her, otherwise she was apt to be embarrassed. "Susan? I was just thinking, are you here yet, Will? Officially, I mean." "No," he said, taking her meaning at once, and likely already seeing where this was going. He seemed sharp enough in his way. "We only arrived in Barony this afternoon, and you're the first person any of us has spoken to. Unless, that is, Richard and Arthur have met folks. I couldn't sleep, and so came out to ride and to think things over a little. We're camped over there." He pointed to the right, on that long slope that runs toward the sea. "Aye, the drop, it's called." She realized that Will and his mates might even be camped on what would be her own land by law before much more time had passed. The thought was amusing and exciting and a little startling. "Tomorrow we ride into town and present our compliments to my Lord Mayor Hart Thorin. He's a bit of a fool, according to what we were told before leaving New Canaan." "Were you indeed told so?" she asked, raising one eyebrow. "Yes. Apt to blabber, fond of strong drink, even more fond of young girls," Will said. "Is it true, would you say?" "I think you must judge for yourself," said she, stifling a smile with some effort. "In any case, we'll also be presenting to the Honorable Kimba Reimer, Thorin's Chancellor, and I understand he knows his beans, and counts his beans as well." "Thorin will have you to dinner at Mayor's house," Susan said. "Perhaps not tomorrow night, but surely the night after." "A dinner of state in Hambry," Will said, smiling and still stroking Rusher's nose. "Gods, how shall I bear the agony of my anticipation?" "Never mind your nettlesome mouth," she said, "but only listen if he'd be my friend. This is important." His smile dropped away, and she saw again, as she had for a moment or two before, the man he'd be before too many more years had passed. The hard face, the concentrated eyes, the merciless mouth. It was a frightening face in a way, a frightening prospect. And yet, still, the place the old hag had touched felt warm, and she found it difficult to take her eyes off him. What, she wondered, was his hair like under that stupid hat he wore? "Tell me, Susan." "If you and your friends come to table at Thorin's, you may see me. If you see me, Will, see me for the first time. See Miss Delgado, as I shall see Mr. Dearborn. Do we take my meaning?" "To the letter." He was looking at her thoughtfully. "Do you serve? Surely if your father was the barony's chief drover, you do not—" "Never mind what I do or don't do. Just promise that if we meet at seafront, we meet for the first time." "I promise.
But no more questions. We've nearly come to the place where we must part ways, and I want to give you a warning. Fair payment for the ride on this nice mount of yours, mayhap. If ye dine with Thorin and Reimer, you'll not be the only new folk at his table. There'll likely be 3 others, men Thorin has hired to serve as private guards of the house."
"Not as sheriff's deputies?"
"Nay, they answer to none but Thorin, or mayhap to Reimer. Their names are Jonas, DePape, and Reynolds. They look like hard boys to me, although Jonas's boyhood is so long behind him that I imagine he's forgot he ever had one."
Jonas is the leader?
Aye. He limps, has hair that falls to his shoulders, pretty as any girl's, and the quavery voice of an old gaffer who spends his days polishing the chimney corner. But I think he's the most dangerous of the three all the same. I'd guess these three have forgot more about helling than you and your friends will ever learn. Now, why had she told him all that? She didn't know exactly. Gratitude, perhaps. He had promised to keep the secret of this late-night meeting, and he had the look of a promise-keeper, in hack with his father or not. I'll watch them, and I thank you for the advice. They were now climbing a long, gentle slope. Overhead, Old Mother blazed relentlessly. Bodyguards, he mused, bodyguards in sleepy little Hambry. It's strange times, Susan. Strange indeed. Aye. She had wondered about Jonas, DePape, and Reynolds herself, and could think of no good reason for them to be in town. Had they been Reimer's doing, Reimer's decision? It seemed likely. Thorin wasn't the sort of man to even think about bodyguards, she would have said. The High Sheriff had always done well enough for him. But still, why? They breasted the hill. Below them lay a nestle of buildings, the village of Hambry. Only a few lights still shone. The brightest cluster marked the Traveller's Rest. From here on the warm breeze she could hear the piano beating out Hey Jude and a score of drunken voices gleefully murdering the chorus. Not the three men of whom she had warned Will Dearborn, though. They would be standing at the bar, watching the room with their flat eyes. Not the singing type were those three. Each had a small blue coffin shape tattooed on his right hand, burned into the webbing between thumb and forefinger. She thought to tell Will this, then realized he'd see for himself soon enough. Instead, she pointed a little way down the slope at a dark shape which overhung the road on a chain. Do you see that? Yes. He heaved a large and rather comical sigh. Is it the object I fear beyond all others? Is it the dread shape of Mrs. Beech's mailbox? Aye, and it's there we must part. If you say we must, we must. Yet I wish— Just then the wind shifted, as it sometimes did in the summer, and blew a strong gust out of the west. The smell of sea salt was gone in an instant, and so was the sound of the drunken, singing voices. What replaced them was a sound infinitely more sinister, one that never failed to produce a scutter of goose-flesh up her back. A low, atonal noise, like the warble of a siren being turned by a man without much longer to live. Will took a step backward, eyes widening, and again she noticed his hands take a dip toward his belt, as if reaching for something not there. What in God's name is that? It's a thinny, she said quietly. In Eyebolt Canyon. Have you never heard of such? Heard of, yes, but never heard until now. Gods, how do you stand it? It sounds alive. She had never thought of it quite like that. But now, in a way listening with his ears instead of her own, she thought he was right. It was as if some sick part of the night had gained a voice and was actually trying to sing. She shivered. Rusher felt the momentary increased pressure of her knees and whickered softly, craning his head around to look at her. "We don't often hear it so clearly at this time of year," she said. "In the fall the men burn it to quiet." "I don't understand." Who did? Who understood anything anymore? Gods, they couldn't even turn off the few oil pumps in Sitco that still worked, although half of them squealed like pigs in a slaughtering chute. These days you were usually just grateful to find things that still worked at all. "In the summer, when there's time, drovers and cowboys drag loads of brush to the mouth of Eyebolt," she said. "Dead brush is all right, but live is better, for it's smoke that's wanted, and the heavier the better. Eyebolt's a box canyon, very short and steep-walled, almost like a chimney lying on its side, you see?" "Yes." "The traditional time for burning is reap morn, the day after the fair and the feast and the fire." "The first day of winter." "Aye, although in these parts it doesn't feel like winter so soon. In any case, it's no tradition. The brush is sometimes lit sooner if the winds have been prankish or if the sound's particularly strong. It upsets the livestock, you know. Cows give poorly when the noise of the thinny's strong, and it makes sleep difficult. I should think it would. Will was still looking north, and a stronger gust of wind blew his hat off. It fell to his back, the rawhide tug-string pulling against the line of his throat. The hair so revealed was a little long and as black as a crow's wing. She felt a sudden, greedy desire to run her hands through it, to let her fingers tell its texture, rough or smooth or silky, and how would it smell? At this she felt another shiver of heat down low in her belly. He turned to her as though he had read her mind, and she flushed, grateful that he wouldn't be able to see the darkening of her cheek. "How long has it been there?" "Since before I was born," she said, "but not before my dad was born. He said that the ground shook in an earthquake just before it came. Some say the earthquake brought it, some say that's superstitious nonsense. All I know is that it's always been there. The smoke quiets it a while, the way it will quiet a hive of bees or wasps, but the sound always comes back. The brush piled at the mouth helps to keep any wandering livestock out, too. Sometimes they're drawn to it, gods know why. But if a cow or sheep does happen to get in, after the burning and before the next year's pile has started to grow, mayhap, it doesn't come back out. Whatever it is, it's hungry." She put his poncho aside, lifted her right leg over the saddle without so much as touching the horn, and slipped off Rusher. All this in a single liquid movement. It was a stunt made for pants rather than a dress, and she knew from the further widening of his eyes that he'd seen a good lot of her. But nothing she had to wash with the bathroom door closed, so what of that? And that quick dismount had ever been a favorite trick of hers when she was in a show-offy mood. "Pretty," he exclaimed. "I learned it from my da," she said, responding to the more innocent interpretation of his compliment. Her smile, as she handed him the reins, however, suggested that she was willing to accept the compliment any way it was meant. "Susan, have you ever seen the thinny?" "Aye, once or twice, from above." "What does it look like?" "Ugly," she responded at once. Until tonight, when she had observed Ria's smile up close and endured her twiddling, meddling fingers, she would have said it was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. "It looks a little like a slow-burning peat fire, and a little like a swamp full of scummy green water. There's a mist that rises off it. Sometimes it looks like long, skinny arms, with hands at the end of 'em." "Is it growing?" "Aye, they say it is, that every thinny grows, but it grows slowly. 'Twon't escape Eyebolt Canyon in your time or mine." She looked up at the sky and saw that the constellations had continued to tilt along their tracks as they spoke. She felt she could talk to him all night, about the thinny or Sitgo or her irritating aunt, or just about anything. And the idea dismayed her. Why should this happen to her now, for the God's sake? After 3 years of dismissing the Hambry boys, why should she now meet a boy who interested her so strangely? Why was life so unfair? Her earlier thought, the one she'd heard in her father's voice, recurred to her. If it's Ka, it'll come like a wind, and your plans will stand before it no more than a barn before a cyclone. But no, and no, and no. So set she, with all her considerable determination, her mind against the idea. This was no barn. This was her life. Susan reached out and touched the rusty tin of Mrs. Beech's mailbox, as if to steady herself in the world. Her little hopes and daydreams didn't mean so much, perhaps, but her father had taught her to measure herself by her ability to do the things she'd said she would do, and she would not overthrow his teachings simply because she happened to encounter a good-looking boy at a time when her body and her emotions were in a stew. "I'll leave you here to either rejoin your friends or resume your ride," she said. The gravity she heard in her voice made her feel a bit sad, for it was an adult gravity. "But remember your promise, Will. If he see me at seafront, mayor's house, and if he'd be my friend, see me there for the first time, as I'd see you." He nodded, and she saw her seriousness now mirrored in his own face, and the sadness, mayhap. "I've never asked a girl to ride out with me, or if she'd accept a visit of me. I'd ask of you, Susan, daughter of Patrick. I'd even bring you flowers to sweeten my chances. But it would do no good, I think." She shook her head. "Nay, 'twouldn't." "Are you promised in marriage? It's forward of me to ask, I know, but I mean no harm." "I'm sure you don't, but I'd as soon not answer. My position is a delicate one just now, as I told you. Besides, it's late. Here's where we part, Will. But stay one more moment." She rummaged in the pocket of her apron and brought out half a cake wrapped in a piece of green leaf. The other half she had eaten on her way up to the coos, in what now felt like the other half of her life. She held what was left of her little evening meal out to Rusher, who sniffed it, then ate it and nuzzled her hand. She smiled, liking the velvet tickle in the cup of her palm. "Aye, thee's a good horse, so you are." She looked at Will Dearborn, who stood in the road, shuffling his dusty boots and gazing at her unhappily. The hard look was gone from his face now. He looked her age again, or younger. "We were well met, weren't we?" he asked. She stepped forward, and before she could let herself think about what she was doing, she put her hands on his shoulders, stood on her toes, and kissed him on the mouth. The kiss was brief, but not sisterly. "Aye, very well met, Will." But when he moved toward her, as thoughtlessly as a flower turning its face to follow the sun, wishing to repeat the experience, she pushed him back a step, gently but firmly. "Nay, that was only a thank you, and one thank you should be enough for a gentleman. Go your course in peace, Will." He took up the reins like a man in a dream, looked at them for a moment as if he didn't know what in the world they were, and then looked back at her. She could see him working to clear his mind and emotions of the impact her kiss had made. She liked him for it, and she was very glad she had done it. "And you yours," he said, swinging into the saddle. "I look forward to meeting you for the first time." He smiled at her, and she saw both longing and wishes in that smile. Then he gigged the horse, turned him, and started back the way they'd come, to have another look at the oil patch, mayhap. She stood where she was, by Mrs. Beech's mailbox, willing him to turn around and wave so she could see his face once more. She felt sure he would, but he didn't. Then, just as she was about to turn away and start down the hill to town, he did turn, and his hand lifted, fluttering for a moment in the dark like a moth. Susan lifted her own in return, and then went her way, feeling happy and unhappy at the same time. Yet, and this was perhaps the most important thing, she no longer felt soiled. When she had touched the boy's lips, Ria's touch seemed to have left her skin. A small magic, perhaps, but she welcomed it. She walked on, smiling a little and looking up at the stars more frequently than was her habit when out after dark. Chapter 4. Long After Moonset. 1. He rode restlessly for nearly 2 hours back and forth along what she called the drop, never pushing Rusher above a trot, although what he wanted to do was gallop the big gelding under the stars until his own blood began to cool a little. "It'll cool plenty if you draw attention to yourself," he thought, "and likely you won't even have to cool it yourself. Fools are the only folk on the earth who can absolutely count on getting what they deserve." That old saying made him think of the scarred and bow-legged man who had been his life's greatest teacher, and he smiled.
At last he turned his horse down the slope to the trickle of brook which ran there, and followed it 1.5 miles upstream. Past several gathers of horse, they looked at Rusher with a kind of sleepy, wall-eyed surprise, to a grove of willows. From the hollow within, a horse whickered softly. Rusher whickered in return, stamping one hoof and nodding his head up and down. His rider ducked his own head as he passed through the willow fronds, and suddenly there was a narrow and inhuman white face hanging before him, its upper half all but swallowed by black pupil-less eyes. He dipped for his guns. The 3rd time tonight he'd done that, and for the 3rd time there was nothing there. Not that it mattered. Already he recognized what was hanging before him on a string, that idiotic rook skull. The young man who was currently calling himself Arthur Heath had taken it off his saddle. It amused him to call the skull so perched there Lookout, ugly as an old gammer but perfect cheap to feed, and hung it here as a prank greeting. Him and his jokes. Rusher's master batted it aside hard enough to break the string and send the skull flying into the dark. "Fie, Roland," said a voice from the shadows. It was reproachful, but there was laughter bubbling just beneath, as there always was. Cuthbert was his oldest friend. The marks of their first teeth had been embedded on many of the same toys, but Roland had in some ways never understood him. Nor was it just his laughter. On the long-ago day when Hax, the palace cook, was to be hung for a traitor on Gallows Hill, Cuthbert had been in an agony of terror and remorse. He told Roland he couldn't stay, couldn't watch. But in the end he had done both. Because neither the stupid jokes nor the easy surface emotions were the truth of Cuthbert Allgood. As Roland entered the hollow at the center of the grove, a dark shape stepped out from behind the tree where it had been keeping. Halfway across the clearing, it resolved itself into a tall, narrow-hipped boy who was barefooted below his jeans and bare-chested above them. In one hand he held an enormous antique revolver, a kind which was sometimes called a beer barrel because of the cylinder's size. "Fie!" Cuthbert repeated, as if he liked the sound of this word, not archaic, only in forgotten backwaters like mages. "That's a fine way to treat the guard of the watch, smacking the poor thin-faced fellow halfway to the nearest mountain range. If I'd been wearing a gun, I likely would have blown it to smithereens and woken half the countryside." "I knew you wouldn't be going about strapped," Cuthbert answered mildly. "You're remarkably ill-looking, Roland, son of Stephen, but nobody's fool, even as you approach the ancient age of 15. I thought we agreed we'd use the names we're traveling under, even among ourselves." Cuthbert stuck out his leg, bare heel planted in the turf, and bowed, with his arms outstretched and his hands strenuously bent at the wrist, an inspired imitation of the sort of man for whom court has become career. He also looked remarkably like a heron standing in a marsh, and Roland snorted laughter in spite of himself. Then he touched the inside of his left wrist to his forehead to see if he had a fever. He felt feverish enough inside his head, gods knew, but the skin above his eyes felt cool. "I cry your pardon, gunslinger," Cuthbert said, his eyes and hands still turned humbly down. The smile on Roland's face died. "And don't call me that again, Cuthbert, please. Not here, not anywhere, not if you value me." Cuthbert dropped his pose at once and came quickly to where Roland sat his horse. He looked honestly humbled. "Roland, Will, I'm sorry." Roland clapped him on the shoulder. "No harm done. Just remember from here on out, Magus may be at the end of the world, but it still is the world. Where's Alen?" "Dick, do you mean?" "Where do you think?" Cuthbert pointed across the clearing to where a dark hulk was either snoring or slowly choking to death. "That one," Cuthbert said, "would sleep through an earthquake." "But you heard me coming and woke." "Yes," Cuthbert said. His eyes were on Roland's face, searching it with an intensity that made Roland feel a little uneasy. "Did something happen to you? You look different." "Do I?" "Yes. Excited. Aired out somehow." If he was going to tell Cuthbert about Susan, now was the time. He decided, without really thinking about it, most of his decisions, certainly the best of them, were made in this same way, not to tell. If he met her at Mayer's house, it would be the first time, as far as Cuthbert and Alen knew as well. What harm in that? I've been properly aired, all right, he said, dismounting and bending to uncinch the girths of his saddle. I've seen some interesting things, too. Ah? Speak, companion of my bosom's dearest tenant. I'll wait until tomorrow, I think. When yon hibernating bear is finally awake, then I only have to tell once. Besides, I'm tired. I'll share you one thing, though. There are too many horses in these parts, even for a barony renowned for its horseflesh. Too many by far. Before Cuthbert could ask any questions, Roland pulled the saddle from Rusher's back and set it down beside 3 small wicker cages which had been bound together with rawhide, making them into a carrier which could be secured to a horse's back. Inside, 3 pigeons with white rings around their necks cooed sleepily. One took his head out from beneath his wing, had a peek at Roland, and then tucked himself away again. "These fellows all right?" Roland asked. "Fine. Pecking and shitting happily in their straw. As far as they're concerned, they're on vacation." "What did you mean about tomorrow?" Roland said. And Cuthbert, seeing that there would be no more, only nodded and went to find his lean and bony lookout. 20 minutes later, Rusher unloaded and rubbed down and set to forage with Buckskin and Glue-Boy. Cuthbert could not even name his horse as a normal person would. Roland lay on his back in his bedroll, looking up at the late stars overhead. Cuthbert had gone back to sleep as easily as he had awakened at the sound of Rusher's hoofs. But Roland had never felt less sleepy in his life. His mind turned back a month, to the whore's room, to his father sitting on the whore's bed and watching him dress. The words his father had spoken, "I have known for 2 years," had reverberated like a struck gong in Roland's head. He suspected they might continue to do so for the rest of his life. But his father had had much more to say, about Martin, about Roland's mother, who was perhaps more sinned against than sinning, about harriers who called themselves patriots, and about John Farson, who had indeed been in Crescia, and who was gone from that place now, vanished, as he had a way of doing, like smoke in a high wind. Before leaving, he and his men had burned Indri, the barony seat, pretty much to the ground. The slaughter had been in the hundreds, and perhaps it was no surprise that Crescia had since repudiated the affiliation and spoken for the good man. The barony governor, the mayor of Indri, and the high sheriff had all ended the early summer day which concluded Farson's visit with their heads on the wall guarding the town's entrance. That was, Stephen Deschain had said, pretty persuasive politics. It was a game of castles, where both armies had come out from behind their hillocks and the final moves had commenced, Roland's father had said, and as was so often the case with popular revolutions, that game was apt to be over before many in the baronies of Midworld had begun to realize that John Farson was a serious threat. Or, if you were one of those who believed passionately in his vision of democracy and an end to what he called class slavery and ancient fairy tales, a serious agent of change. His father and his father's small ka-tet of gunslingers, Roland was amazed to learn, cared little about Farson in either light. They looked upon him as small cheese, looked upon the affiliation itself as small cheese, come to that. "I'm going to send you away," Stephen had said, sitting there on the bed and looking somberly at his only son, the one who had lived. "There is no true safe place left in Midworld, but the barony of Magus on the clean sea is as close to true safety as any place may be these days, so it's there you'll go, along with at least 2 of your mates, Alan, I suppose, for one. Just not that laughing boy for the other, I beg of you. You'd be better off with a barking dog." Roland, who on any other day in his life would have been overjoyed at the prospect of seeing some of the wider world, had protested hotly. If the final battles against the good man were at hand, he wanted to fight them at his father's side. He was a gunslinger now, after all, if only apprentice, and his father had shaken his head, slowly and emphatically. "No, Roland, you don't understand. You shall, however, as well as possible, you shall." Later the 2 of them had walked the high battlements above Midworld's last living city, Green and gorgeous Gilead in the morning sun, with its pennons flapping, and the vendors in the streets of the old quarter, and horses trotting on the bridle paths which radiated out from the palace standing at the heart of everything. His father had told him more, not everything, and he had understood more, far from everything, nor did his father understand everything. The Dark Tower had not been mentioned by either of them, but already it hung in Roland's mind, a possibility like a storm cloud far away on the horizon. Was the tower what all of this was really about? Not a jumped-up harrier with dreams of ruling Midworld, not the wizard who had enchanted his mother, not the glass ball which Stephen and his posse had hoped to find in Cressia, but the Dark Tower? He hadn't asked. He hadn't dared ask. Now he shifted in his bedroll and closed his eyes. He saw the girl's face at once. He felt her lips pressed firmly against his own again, and smelled the scent of her skin. He was instantly hot from the top of his head to the base of his spine, cold from the base of his spine to the tips of his toes. Then he thought of the way her legs had flashed as she slid from Rusher's back, also the glimmer of the undergarments beneath her briefly raised dress, and his hot half and cold half changed places. The whore had taken his virginity but wouldn't kiss him, had turned her face aside when he tried to kiss her. She had allowed him to do whatever else he wanted, but not that. At the time he'd been bitterly disappointed. Now he was glad. The eye of his adolescent mind, both restless and clear, considered the braid which fell down her back to her waist, the soft dimples which had formed at the corners of her mouth when she smiled, the lilt of her voice, her old-fashioned way of saying I and nay, ye and yer and da. He thought of how her hands had felt on his shoulders as she stretched up to kiss him, and thought he would give everything he owned to feel her hands there again, so light and so firm, and her mouth on his. It was a mouth that knew only a little about kissing, he guessed, but that was a little more than he knew himself. Be careful, Roland. Don't let your feeling for this girl tip anything over. She's not free anyway, she said as much. Not married, but spoken for in some other way. Roland was far from the relentless creature he would eventually become, but the seeds of that relentlessness were there, small, stony things that would in their time grow into trees with deep roots and bitter fruit. Now one of these seeds cracked open and sent up its first sharp blade. What's been spoken for may be unspoken, and what's done may be undone. Nothing sure but I want her. Yes, that was the one thing he did know, and he knew it as well as he knew the face of his father. He wanted her. Not as he had wanted the whore when she lay naked on her bed with her legs spread and her half-lidded eyes looking up at him, but in the way he wanted food when he was hungry, or water when he was thirsty. In the way he supposed that he wanted to drag Martin's dusty body behind his horse down Gilead's high road in payment for what the wizard had done to his mother. He wanted her. He wanted the girl Susan. Roland turned over on his other side, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. His rest was thin and lit by the crudely poetic dreams only adolescent boys have. Dreams where sexual attraction and romantic love come together and resonate more powerfully than they ever will again. In these thirsty visions, Susan Delgado put her hands on Roland's shoulders over and over, kissed his mouth over and over, told him over and over to come to her for the first time, to be with her for the first time, to see her for the first time, to see her very well. 2. 5 miles or so from where Roland slept and dreamed his dreams, Susan Delgado lay in her bed and looked out her window and watched Old Star begin to grow pale with the approaching dawn. Sleep was no closer now than it had been when she lay down, and there was a throb between her legs where the old woman had touched her. It was distracting, but no longer unpleasant, because she now associated it with the boy she'd met on the road and impulsively kissed by starlight. Every time she shifted her legs, that throb flared into a brief, sweet ache. When she'd got home, Aunt Cord, who would have been in her own bed an hour before on any ordinary night, had been sitting in her rocking-chair by the fireplace, dead and cold and swept clean of ashes at this time of year, with a lapful of lace that looked like wave froth against her dowdy black dress. She was edging it with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to Susan, and she hadn't looked up when the door opened and her niece came in on a swirl of breeze.
"I expected you an hour ago,"
Aunt Cord said, and then, although she didn't sound it, "I was worried." "Aye?" Susan said, and said no more. She thought that on any other night she would have offered one of her fumbling excuses, which always sounded like a lie to her own ears. It was the effect Aunt Cord had had on her all her life. But this hadn't been an ordinary night. Never in her life had there been a night like this. She found she could not get Will Dearborn out of her mind. Aunt Cord had looked up then, her close-set, rather beady eyes sharp and inquisitive above her narrow blade of a nose. Some things hadn't changed since Susan had set out for the Coos. She had still been able to feel her aunt's eyes brushing across her face and down her body like little whisk brooms with sharp bristles.
"What took you so long?" Aunt Cord had asked. "Was there trouble?"
"No trouble," Susan had replied, but for a moment she thought of how the witch had stood beside her in the doorway, pulling her braid through the gnarled tube of one loosely clenched fist. She remembered wanting to go, and she remembered asking Rhea if their business was done.
"Mayhap there's one more little thing," the old woman had said,
or so Susan thought. But what had that one more little thing been? She couldn't remember. And really, what did it matter? She was shut of Rhea until her belly began to rise with Thorin's child. And if there could be no baby-making until reap night, she'd not be returning to the Coos until late winter at the soonest. An age. And it would be longer than that, were she slow to kindle.
"I walked slowly coming home, Aunt, that's all."
"Then why look ye so?" Aunt Cord had asked, scant brows knitting toward the vertical line which creased her brow.
"How so?"
Susan had asked, taking off her apron and knotting the strings and hanging it on the hook just inside the kitchen door.
"Flushy, frothy, like milk fresh out of the cow."
She'd almost laughed. Aunt Cord, who knew as little about men as Susan did about the stars and planets, had struck it directly. Flushy and frothy was exactly how she felt.
"Only the night air, I suppose," she had said.
"I saw a meteor, Aunt, and heard the thinny. The sound's strong tonight."
"Aye?"
her aunt asked without interest, then returned to the subject which did interest her.
"Did it hurt?"
"A little."
"Did you cry?"
Susan shook her head. "Good. Better not. Always better. She likes it when they cry, I've heard."
"Now, Sue, did she give you something? Did the old pussy give you something?"
"Aye." She reached into her pocket and brought out the paper with honest written upon it. She held it out, and her aunt snatched it away with a greedy look. Cordelia had been quite the sugar plum over the last month or so, but now that she had what she wanted, and now that Susan had come too far and promised too much to have a change of heart, she'd reverted to the sour, supercilious, often suspicious woman Susan had grown up with. The one who'd been driven into almost weekly bouts of rage by her phlegmatic laugh-goes-as-twill brother. In a way, it was a relief. It had been nerve-wracking to have Aunt Cord playing Sibylla Goodsprite day after day. "Aye, there's her mark, all right," her aunt had said, tracing her fingers over the bottom of the sheet. "A devil's hoof's what it means, some say, but what do we care, eh, Sue? Nasty, horrid creature that she is, she still made it possible for two women to get on in the world a little longer. And you'll only have to see her once more, probably around year's end when you've caught proper." "It will be later than that,"
Susan had told her. I'm not to lie with him until the full of the demon moon, after the reaping fair and the bonfire.
Aunt Cord had stared, eyes wide, mouth open.
Said she so?
Are you calling me a liar, Auntie? She had thought, with a sharpness that wasn't much like her. Usually her nature was more like her father's.
Aye. But why? Why so long?
Aunt Cord was obviously upset, obviously disappointed. There had so far been 8 pieces of silver and 4 of gold out of this. They were tucked up wherever it was that Aunt Cord squirreled her money away, and Susan suspected there was a fair amount of it, although Cordelia liked to plead poverty at every opportunity. And twice that much was still owed, or would be once the blood-stained sheet went to the mayor's house laundress. That same amount would be paid yet again when Rhea had confirmed the baby and the baby's honesty. A lot of money, all told, a great lot for a little place like this and little folk like them. And now to have the paying of it put back so far. Then came a sin Susan had prayed over, although without much enthusiasm, before getting into her bed. She had rather enjoyed the cheated, frustrated look on Aunt Cord's face, the look of the thwarted miser.
"Why so long?" she repeated. "I suppose you could go up to the coos and ask her."
Cordelia Delgado's lips, thin to begin with, had pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared.
"Are you pert, missy? Are you pert with me?"
"No, I'm much too tired to be pert with anyone. I want to wash, I can still feel her hands on me, so I can, and go to bed."
"Then do so. Perhaps in the morning we can discuss this in more ladylike fashion. And we must go and see Hart, of course."
She folded the paper Rhea had given Susan, looking pleased at the prospect of visiting Hart Thorin, and moved her hand toward her dress pocket.
"No,"
Susan said, and her voice had been unusually sharp, enough so to freeze her aunt's hand in mid-air. Cordelia had looked at her, frankly startled. Susan had felt a little embarrassed by that look, but she hadn't dropped her eyes, and when she held out her own hand, it had been steady enough.
"I'm to have the keeping of that, Aunt."
"Who tells you to speak so?" Aunt Cord had asked, her voice almost whining with outrage. It was close to blasphemy, Susan supposed, but for a moment Aunt Cord's voice had reminded her of the sound the thinny made.
"Who tells you to speak so? To the woman who raised a motherless girl, to the sister of that girl's poor dead father."
"You know who," Susan said. She still held her hand out. "I'm to keep it, and I'm to give it to Mayor Thorin. She said she didn't care what happened to it then. He could wipe his bum with it for all of her." The flush which suffused her aunt's face at that had been very enjoyable.
"But until then, it was to be in my keeping." "I never heard of such a thing,"
Aunt Cordelia had huffed, but she had handed the grimy scrap of paper back.
"Given the keep of such an important document to a mere scrap of a girl.
Yet not too mere a scrap to be his Jilly, am I? To lie under him and listen to his bones creak, and take his seed and mayhap bear his child." She dropped her eyes to her pocket as she put the paper away again, not wanting Aunt Cord to see the resentment in them.
"Go up,"
Aunt Cord had said, brushing the froth of lace off her lap and into her work-basket, where it lay in an unaccustomed tangle.
"And when you wash, do your mouth with especial care. Cleanse it of its impudence and disrespect toward those who have given up much for love of its owner."
Susan had gone silently, biting back 1,000 retorts, mounting the stairs as she had so often, throbbing with a mixture of shame and resentment. And now here she was, in her bed and still awake, as the stars paled away and the first brighter shades began to color the sky. The events of the night just past slipped through her mind in a kind of fantastical blur, like shuffled playing cards. And the one which turned up with the most persistence was the face of Will Dearborn. She thought of how that face could be hard at one moment and soften so unexpectedly at the next. And was it a handsome face? Aye, she thought so. For herself, she knew so. "I've never asked a girl to ride out with me, or if she would accept a visit of me. I would ask you, Susan, daughter of Patrick."
"Why now? Why should I meet him now, when no good can come of it?"
"If it's Ka, it'll come like a wind. like a cyclone. She tossed from one side of the bed to the other, then at last rolled onto her back again. There would be no sleep for her in what remained of this night, she thought. She might as well walk out on the drop and watch the sun come up. Yet she continued to lie in bed, feeling somehow sick and well at the same time, looking into the shadows and listening to the first cries of the morning birds, thinking of how his mouth had felt against hers, the tender grain of it, and the feeling of his teeth below his lips, the smell of his skin, the rough texture of his shirt under her palms. She now put those palms against the top of her shift and cupped her breasts with her fingers. The nipples were hard like little pebbles, and when she touched them the heat between her legs flared suddenly and urgently. She could sleep, she thought. She could if she took care of that heat, if she knew how. And she did. The old woman had shown her. Even a girl who's intact don't need to lack for a shiver now and then. Like a little bud of silk, so it is. Susan shifted in bed and slipped a hand deep beneath the sheet. She forced the old woman's bright eyes and hollow cheeks out of her mind. It wasn't hard to do at all once you set your mind to it, she discovered, and replaced it with the face of the boy with the big gelding and the silly flat-crowned hat. For a moment the vision of her mind became so clear and so sweet that it was real, and all the rest of her life only a drab dream. In this vision he kissed her over and over, their mouths widening, their tongues touching. What he breathed out, she breathed in. She burned. She burned in her bed like a torch. And when the sun finally came over the horizon some short time later, she lay deeply asleep, with a faint smile on her lips, and her unbraided hair lying across the side of her face and pillow like loose gold. III. In the last hour before dawn, the public room of the Traveller's Rest was as quiet as it ever became. The gaslights which turned the chandelier into a brilliant jewel until 2 of the clock or so on most nights were now turned down to guttering blue points, and the long, high room was shadowy and spectral. In one corner lay a jumble of kindling, the remains of a couple of chairs smashed in a fight over a watch-me game. The combatants were currently residing in the High Sheriff's drunk cell. In another corner was a fairly large puddle of congealing puke. On the raised platform at the east end of the room stood a battered piano. Propped against its bench was the ironwood club which belonged to Barky, the saloon's bouncer and all-around tough man. Barky himself, the naked mound of his scarred stomach rising above the waistband of his corduroy pants like a clot of bread dough, lay under the bench, snoring. In one hand he held a playing card, the deuce of diamonds. At the west end of the room were the card tables. 2 drunks lay with their heads on one of these, snoring and drooling on the green felt, their outstretched hands touching. Above them on the wall was a picture of Arthur, the great king of Eld, astride his white stallion, and a sign which read, in a curious mixture of high and low speech, "Argue not about the hand you are dealt in cards or life." Mounted behind the bar, which ran the length of the room, was a monstrous trophy, a 2-headed elk with a rack of antlers like a forest grove and 4 glaring eyes. This beast was known to local habitués of the Travelers as the Romp. None could have said why. Some wit had carefully drawn a pair of sow-titty condoms over the prongs of 2 of its antlers. Lying on the bar itself, and directly beneath the Romp's disapproving gaze, was Petty the Trotter, one of the Travelers' dancers and jilly girls. Although Petty's actual girlhood was well behind her now, and soon she would be reduced to doing her business on her knees behind the Travelers rather than upstairs in one of the tiny cribs. Her plump legs were spread, one dangling over the bar on the inside, one on the outside, the filthy tangle of her skirt frothed up between. She breathed in long snores, occasionally twitching at the feet and fat fingers. The only other sounds were the hot summer wind outside and the soft, regular snap of cards being turned one by one. A small table stood by itself near the bat-wing doors which gave upon the Hambry High Street. It was here that Coral Thorin, owner of the Traveller's Rest, and the mayor's sister sat on the nights when she descended from her suite to be a part of the company. When she came down early, when there were still more steaks than whiskey being served across the old scratched bar, and went back up around the time that Sheb, the piano player, sat down and began to pound his hideous instrument. The mayor himself never came in at all, although it was well known that he owned at least a half-interest in the Travellers. Clan Thorin enjoyed the money the place brought in. They just didn't enjoy the look of it after midnight, when the sawdust spread on the floor began to soak up the spilled beer and the spilled blood. Yet there was a hard streak in Coral, who had 20 years before been what was called a wild child. She was younger than her political brother, not so thin, and good-looking in a large-eyed, weasel-headed way. No one sat at her table during the saloon's operating hours. Barkey would have put a stop to anyone who tried, and double quick. But operating hours were over now. The drunks mostly gone or passed out upstairs, Sheb curled up and fast asleep in the corner behind his piano. The soft-headed boy who cleaned the place had been gone since 2 o'clock or so, chased out by jeers and insults and a few flying beer glasses, as he always was. Roy DePape, in particular, had no love in his heart for that particular lad. He would be back around 9 or so to begin readying the old party palace for another night of hilarity. But until then the man sitting at Mistress Thorin's table had the place to himself. A game of patience was laid out before him, black on red, red on black, the partially formed square accord above all, just as it was in the affairs of men. In his left hand the player held the remains of the deck. As he flipped the cards up, one by one, the tattoo on his right hand moved. It was disconcerting somehow, as if the coffin were breathing. The card player was an oldish fellow, not as thin as the mayor or his sister, but thin. His long white hair straggled down his back. He was deeply tanned except for his neck, where he always burned. The flesh hung there in scant wattles. He wore a mustache so long the ragged white ends hung nearly to his jaw. A sham gunslinger's mustache, many thought it. But no one used the word sham to Eldred Jonas's face. He wore a white silk shirt, and a black-handled revolver hung low on his hip. His large, red-rimmed eyes looked sad on first glance. A second, closer look showed them only to be watery. Of emotion they were as dead as the eyes of the romp. He turned up the ace of wands. No place for it. "Pa, you bugger," he said in an odd, reedy voice. It quavered as well, like the voice of a man on the verge of tears. It fit perfectly with his damp and red-rimmed eyes. He swept the cards together. Before he could reshuffle, a door opened and closed softly upstairs. Jonas put the cards aside and dropped his hand to the butt of his gun. Then, as he recognized the sound of Reynolds' boots coming along the gallery, he let go of the gun and drew his tobacco pouch from his belt instead. The hem of the cloak Reynolds always wore came into view, and then he was coming down the stairs, his face freshly washed and his curly red hair hanging about his ears. Vain of his looks was dear old Mr. Reynolds, and why not? He'd sent his cock on its exploring way up more damp and cozy cracks than Jonas had ever seen in his life, and Jonas was twice his age. At the bottom of the stairs, Reynolds walked along the bar, pausing to squeeze one of Petty's plump thighs. and then crossed to where Jonas sat with his makings and his deck of cards.
"Evening, Eldred. Morning, Clay."
Jonas opened the sack, took out a paper, and sprinkled tobacco into it. His voice shook, but his hands were steady.
"Like a smoke?"
"I could do with one." Reynolds pulled out a chair, turned it around, and sat with his forearms crossed on its back. When Jonas handed him the cigarette, Reynolds danced it along the backs of his fingers, an old gunslinger trick. The big coffin hunters were full of old gunslinger tricks.
"Where's Roy? With her nibs?"
They had been in Hambry a little over a month now, and in that time DePape had conceived a passion for a 15-year-old whore named Deborah. Her bow-legged, clumping walk and her way of squinting off into the distance led Jonas to suspect that she was just another cowgirl from a long line of them, but she had high-hat ways. It was Clay who had started calling the girl her nibs or her majesty, or sometimes, when drunk, Roy's coronation cunt. Reynolds now nodded.
"It's like he's drunk on her." "He'll be all right. He ain't throwing us over for some little snuggle bunny with pimples on her tits. Why, she's so ignorant she can't spell cat. Not so much as cat, no, I asked her."
Jonas made a second cigarette, drew a sulphur match from the sack, and popped it alight with his thumbnail. He lit Reynolds first, then his own. A small yellow cur came in under the bat-wing doors. The men watched it in silence, smoking. It crossed the room, first sniffed at the curdled vomit in the corner, then began to eat it. Its stub of a tail wagged back and forth as it dined. Reynolds nodded toward the admonition not to argue about the cards you were dealt.
"That mutt'd understand that, I'd say." "Not at all, not at all," Jonas demurred. "Just a dog is all he is, a spew-eating dog. I heard a horse 20 minutes ago, first on the come, then on the go. Would it have been one of our hired watchmen?" "You don't miss a trick, do you?" "Don't pay to." "No, don't pay a bit. Was it?" "Yep. Fella who works for one of the small freeholders out along the east end of the drop. He seen 'em come in. 3, young, babbies." Reynolds pronounced this last as they did in the northern baronies, babbies. "Nothing to worry of." Now, we don't know that," Jonas said, his quavering voice making him sound like a temporizing old man. "Young eyes see far, they say." "Young eyes see what they're pointed at," Reynolds replied. The dog trotted past him, licking its chops. Reynolds helped it on its way with a kick the cur was not quite quick enough to avoid. It scuttled back out under the bat wings, uttering little yike-yike sounds that made Barky snort thickly from his place of rest beneath the piano bench. His hand opened, and the playing card dropped out of it. "Maybe so, maybe not," Jonas said. "In any case, they're affiliation brats, sons of big estates off in the green somewhere, if Reimer and that fool he works for have it straight. That means we'll be very, very careful. Walk easy, like on eggshells. Why, we've got 3 more months here at least, and those young'uns may be here that whole time, counting this and counting that and putting it all down on paper. Folks counting things ain't good for us right now, not for men in the resupply business." "Come on, it's make work, that's all. A slap on the wrist for getting in trouble. They're daddies, no Farsons in charge of the whole southwest edge now and sitting on high ground. The brats may know the same, that playtime's pert near over for the affiliation and all its pukesome royalty. Can't know, Clay. With folks like these, you can't know which way they'll jump. At the very least, they may try to do a half-decent job just to try and get on the good side of their parents again. We'll know better when we see 'em, but I tell you one thing. We can't just put guns to the backs of their heads and drop 'em like broke-leg hosses if they see the wrong thing. Their daddies might be mad at 'em alive, but I think they'd be very tender of 'em dead. That's just the way daddies are. We'll want to be trig, Clay, as trig as we can be." "Better leave DePape out of it, then." "Roy will be fine," Jonas said in his quavery voice. He dropped the stub of his cigarette to the floor and crushed it under his boot heel. He looked up at the romp's glassy eyes and squinted as if calculating. "Tonight, your friend said? They arrive tonight, these brats?"
"Yep."
"They'll be in to see Avery tomorrow, then, I reckon."
This was Herc Avery, High Sheriff of Magus and Chief Constable of Hambry, a large man who was as loose as a trundle of laundry.
"Reckon so," Clay Reynolds said, "to present their papers and all." "Yes, sir, yes, indeedy. How-de-do, and how-de-do, and how-de-do again."
Reynolds said nothing. He often didn't understand Jonas, but he had been riding with him since the age of 15, and knew it was usually better not to ask for enlightenment. If you did, you were apt to end up listening to a cult-manny lecture about the other worlds the old buzzard had visited through what he called the special doors. As far as Reynolds was concerned, there were enough ordinary doors in the world to keep him busy.
"I'll speak to Reimer, and Reimer'll talk to the sheriff about where they should stay," Jonas said. "I think the bunkhouse at the old Bar K Ranch, you know where I mean?"
Reynolds did. In a barony like Magus, you got to know the few landmarks in a hurry. The Bar K was a deserted spread of land northwest of town, not too far from that weird, squalling canyon. They burned at the mouth of the canyon every fall, and once, 6 or 7 years ago, the wind had shifted and gone back wrong and burned most of the Bar K to the ground. Barns, stables, the home place. It had spared the bunkhouse, however, and that would be a good spot for 3 tenderfeet from the inners. It was away from the drop. It was also away from the oil patch.
"You like it, don't you?"
Jonas asked, putting on a hick Hambry accent.
"Ah, ye like it very much, I can see ye do, my cully. You know what they say in Crescia? If you'd steal the silver from the dining room, first put the dog in the pantry."
Reynolds nodded. It was good advice.
"And those trucks, those what-do-you-call-'ems, tankers?" "Fine where they are," Jonas said. "Not that we could move 'em now without attracting the wrong kind of attention, eh? You and Roy want to go out there and cover 'em with brush, lay it on nice and thick. Day after tomorrow you'll do it."
"And where will you be while we're flexing our muscles out at Sitco?"
"By daylight? Preparing for dinner at Mayor's house, you clod. The dinner Thorin will be giving to introduce his guests from the great world to the shit-picky society of the smaller one."
Jonas began making another cigarette. He gazed up at the romp rather than at what he was doing and still spilled barely a scrap of tobacco.
"A bath, a shave, a trim of these tangled old man's locks. I might even wax my mustache, Clay. What do you say to that?"
"Don't strain yourself, Eldred." Jonas laughed, the sound shrill enough to make Barky mutter and Petty stir uneasily on her makeshift bar-top bed. "So Roy and I aren't invited to this fancy do?"
"You'll be invited, oh yes, you'll be invited very warmly," Jonas said, and handed Reynolds the fresh cigarette.
He began making another for himself.
"I'll offer your excuses. I'll do you boys proud. Count on me. Strong men may weep."
"Also, we can spend the day out there in the dust and stink covering those hulks. You're too kind, Jonas."
"I'll be asking questions as well," Jonas said dreamily, "drifting here and there, looking spruce, smelling of bayberries, and asking my little questions. I've known folks in our line of trade who'll go to a fat, jolly fella to find out the gossip, a saloon keeper or a bartender, perhaps a livery stable owner, or one of the chubby fellas who always hangs about the jail or the courthouse with his thumbs tucked into his vest pockets. As for myself, Clay, I find that a woman's best, and the narrower the better, one with more nose than tits sticking off her. I look for one who don't paint her lips and keeps her hair scrooped back against her head."
"You have someone in mind?"
"Yeah. Cordelia Delgado's her name."
"Delgado?"
"You know the name. It's on the lips of everyone in this town, I reckon. Susan Delgado, our esteemed mayor's soon-to-be Jilly. Cordelia's her auntie. Now, here's a fact of human nature I have found. Folk are more apt to talk to someone like her who plays them close than they are to the local jolly types who'll buy you a drink. And that lady plays them close. I'm going to slip in next to her at that dinner, and I'm going to compliment her on the perfume I doubt like hell she'll be wearing, and I'm going to keep a wine glass full. Now, how sounds that for a plan?" "A plan for what? That's what I want to know." "For the game of castles we may have to play," Jonas said, and all the lightness dropped out of his voice. "We're to believe that these boys have been sent here more as a punishment than to do any real job of work. It sounds plausible, too. I've known rakes in my time, and it sounds plausible indeed. I believe it each day until about 3 in the morning, and then a little doubt sets in. And do you know what, Clay?" Reynolds shook his head. "I'm right to doubt. Just as I was right to go with Reimer to old man Thorin and convince him that Farson's glass would be better with the witch woman for the nonce. She'll keep it in a place where a gunslinger couldn't find it, let alone a nosy lad who's yet to have his first piece of ass. These are strange times. A storm's coming, and when you know the wind is going to blow, it's best to keep your gear battened down." He looked at the cigarette he had made. He had been dancing it along the backs of his knuckles, as Reynolds had done earlier. Jonas pushed back the fall of his hair and tucked the cigarette behind his ear. "I don't want to smoke," he said, standing up and stretching. His back made small crackling sounds. "I'm crazy to smoke at this hour of the morning. Too many cigarettes apt to keep an old man like me awake." He walked toward the stairs, squeezing Petty's bare leg as he went by, also as Reynolds had done. At the foot of the stairs, he looked back. "I don't want to kill them. Things are delicate enough without that. I'll smell quite a little wrong on them and not lift a finger, no, not a single finger of my hand. But I'd like to make them clear on their place in the great scheme of things." "Give 'em a sore paw." Jonas brightened. "Yes, sir, partner. Maybe a sore paw's just what I'd like to give 'em. Make 'em think twice about tangling with the big coffin hunters later on, when it matters. Make them swing wide around us when they see us in their road. Yes, sir, that's something to think about. It really is." He started up the stairs, chuckling a little, his limp quite pronounced. It got worse late at night. It was a limp Roland's old teacher, Court, might have recognized, for Court had seen the blow which caused it. Court's own father had dealt it with an ironwood club, breaking Eldred Jonas's leg in the yard behind the great hall of Gilead, before taking the boy's weapon and sending him west, gunless, into exile. Eventually, the man the boy had become had found a gun, of course. The exiles always did, if they looked hard enough. That such guns could never be quite the same as the big ones with the sandalwood grips might haunt them for the rest of their lives, but those who needed guns could still find them, even in this world. Reynolds watched until he was gone, then took his seat at Coral Thorin's desk, shuffled the cards, and continued the game which Jonas had left half-finished. Outside, the sun was coming up.